And in the season finale of Loki, he shows up at the TVA and he watches Victor Timely go out. Immediately, he runs up to OB and says, "What could we have done differently?" And OB's answer is, "We had to be quicker." So Loki tries that. He tries showing up and scurrying Victor Timely out the door, but still, it doesn't work. So he goes back farther. He goes back to the first time that Victor Timely showed up at the TVA, and he starts to hurry him through the process. But still, doesn't matter. He goes back to when they re-kidnap Victor Timely, and he hurries him through the process, but it still doesn't matter. So Loki goes back even farther, to the moment where he introduces OB and Victor Timely. He reaches a problem, though, when OB says, "Well, it's going to take me a bit to reconfigure the prototype." So Loki asks him, "Well, how long will it take you to teach me what you know?" And the answer is centuries. So Loki keeps replaying it for centuries until he is an absolute wizard in the departments of mechanics, physics, and engineering. When he finally has a good enough grasp to build the multiplier, he goes back to that moment. He scurries Victor Timely through the process. He builds the multiplier so they're not wasting any more time. By the way, this is taking everybody by surprise because they can't figure out how exactly Loki knows all this. And the whole time, he's just reassuring everybody, no, this will work. Don't worry, this will work. But of course, they're a little skeptical. Loki pushes on, putting Victor Timely in the suit, handing him the multiplier, and even giving him warnings that Loki's seen before that ended up causing destruction, like the multiplier rolling off the walkway, an area of the walkway where he trips, things like that. As Victor makes his way out, they then just take their places, waiting to see if it'll work. And finally, after centuries of trying, Loki is able to get it where Victor Timely walks down that walkway, loads up the multiplier, spins the device, shoots it off, and it works. Victor Timely is even able to get back to the TVA unscathed. Because of this, the entire group is celebrating, but nobody more so than Loki. They all are able to sit back and watch as the Loom is starting to get things back in order. But that celebration is short-lived when OB and Casey go and look at the readings and something's not right. Loki, now being an expert in the field, also goes to look at those readings and, yeah, something isn't right because the Loom is going back to the way it was. And Loki can't figure it out. I mean, they did everything they were supposed to. They scaled this thing. But that's when Victor pipes up and says, it's not going to matter. The Loom wasn't built to continuously scale. So no matter what you guys do, you're always going to run into this problem. With Loki realizing that he did everything to save that Loom and it didn't matter, the only thing left to do is save He Who Remains. He goes back to the moment where Sylvie was about to kill He Who Remains and he tries to get her to stop. He explains that what she's about to do is going to start a chain reaction that will end everything. But of course, she doesn't believe him, and she says, if you want me to stop, you're going to have to kill me. They start a little bit of a fight. Of course, Loki not really trying to win. He doesn't want to hurt Sylvie. And in the end, Sylvie kills He Who Remains. But Loki replays this over and over again. Every time trying to get through to Sylvie, every time failing, and He Who Remains ends up surviving. It gets to the point where Loki turns to He Who Remains and says, why aren't you trying to stop her? So He Who Remains does. He is able to pause time, freeze Sylvie in her tracks. She's not able to move. And it allows He Who Remains and Loki to sit down and actually have a chat. It's there that He Who Remains explains all the time slipping. All of that wasn't a glitch. It was him. He planned all of this. He wasn't about to let Sylvie actually kill him. No. He set this whole thing up. And he's actually really surprised that Loki hasn't been able to figure out how to pause time. But they go through the conversation so many times that Loki is finally able to pause time. So while He Who Remains thinks it's the first time they've had this conversation, they've actually had this conversation a dozen, hundreds, thousands, millions of times. While this is a really nice little trick, though, Loki does have a Sophie's choice. His options are pretty simple. He either kills Sylvie and saves the TVA, saves time, leaving He Who Remains at the helm, or he lets Sylvie kill He Who Remains. And then we all know how that ends. But Loki has another idea. What if he were just to destroy the Loom? But He Who Remains says you can't do that. I mean, the loom prevents a brutal war where nothing survives, not even the sacred timeline. He asks Loki, can't you see what I'm offering here is mercy? I'm the guy who has to make those tough decisions. Every moment of peace you've ever had, it's been because of me. Loki, however, vows to find another way. He decides to time slip back to the moment he ended up getting arrested by Mobius, and he was interrogated. And he asks Mobius, how do you choose who lives and who dies? Mobius goes into explaining how they prune and how it just keeps the timeline together. But Loki asks, what comfort is that? And Mobius laughs and says, comfort? There's no comfort. Comfort in the TVA? No. Let me tell you a story. There was a hunter one time who had pruned plenty and not even thought twice about it. But there was one variant who was set to kill thousands. I mean, thousands of deaths from one variant. It seems pretty cut and dry. But when the hunter got there, the variant was an 8-year-old boy, just sitting by a pond, minding his own business. So the hunter had to pause because they were faced with a tough dilemma. And during that pause, variants started popping up, branches started popping up. Those variants ended up killing others. A couple of hunters ended up dying, all because one hunter paused to think about whether or not she wanted to prune a child that would kill thousands. Now, luckily, another hunter stepped in and did prune the boy before it could get really out of hand. But nobody ever would have died except the boy had that one hunter just kept the bigger picture in their mind. And as it turns out, by the way, that hunter ends up being Renslayer. Loki suddenly has an idea of what he has to do. He probably is going to have to kill Sylvie, keeping the bigger picture in mind. But he wants to get her blessing for it. So he goes back to the moment where everybody was disappearing, and Sylvie was the last person to do that, and he pauses time. He explains to her that he's gone through this process millions of times, and the only way that everything survives is if she doesn't kill He Who Remains. She knows that means that Loki would have to kill her, but she's not going to give him her papal blessing. She tells him that he would just be replacing one nightmare with another. And this is a woman who's lived through a bunch of apocalypses, and she reminds Loki of that, telling him it's okay to break things from time to time. He thinks about her words and realizes maybe she's right. Maybe they could replace that nightmare with something better. So he time slips back to the moment where Victor Timely opened up the blast doors. But instead of letting Victor Timely go, Loki decides to volunteer this time. It takes Mobius and Sylvie completely off guard, and they definitely don't want him to go. But Loki doesn't give him a choice. He locks the door behind him so they can't stop him. Using his powers, he's able to open up the blast door and just walks out. And he's not harmed at all, which does make you wonder why he didn't just volunteer in the first place. Could have saved a lot of time. But as he makes his way down the walkway, he starts to look like his old self wearing that ridiculous costume. He gets close enough where he can use his powers to stretch the loom out, and using all his might, he destroys it. All the while, everybody back at the TVA is wondering what is going on. Because when the loom got destroyed, all the branches of time, they just floated around, dying. And nobody knew what that was going to mean for everybody. Even Loki didn't know what exactly it was going to mean. And he was surprised to see all these branches just floating around dead. But when he touched them, it kind of reinvigorated them a little bit, brought them back to life. So he started grabbing them. And then he started walking through time, one foot in front of the other, all the while grabbing different branches that he could bring with him. He walked and walked until finally he got to the end of time. He got to the throne that He Who Remains used to sit in, and he was able to sit down, connecting all of the branches, and not building a loom this time, but starting a tree of time. This works. The TVA is saved. Loki sits at the end of time, controlling it all and keeping it all together. As for the TVA, it seems like a much happier place. They've even brought back Miss Minutes. And though Opie doesn't know if she'll try to kill anybody, he's hopeful that she won't. Instead of having 3 judges in charge of everything, they've really opened it up to allowing a free Discord for anybody to voice their opinions. It's something that Hunter B15 really, really enjoys. Before she heads into that meeting, she does ask Mobius if any of He Who Remains' variants have popped up on the timeline. And there have been a few, but for the most part, they're keeping it under check. None of them have any idea about the TVA. One of those variants, by the way, is a young Victor Timely that didn't have the TVA manual dropped into his window. So he just goes about living his life. We think. This, however, will likely be the last report that Mobius gives to Hunter B15, because he tells her, I'm leaving. I don't think anyone's really going to miss an old analyst here, but I just have to find out. She's pretty broken up about it, but does let him know, if you ever want a seat in there, it's yours. Mobius is always going to be welcome back to the TVA. And then she heads in. Mobius heads off to go see that life that he could have had. And from a distance, he watches Don play with his two boys, thinking about what could have been. He's not alone, though. Sylvie is with him. Sylvie just stopped by to make sure he's okay and say goodbye. He does ask her, where are you going to go? And the truth is, she has no idea. She's just going to kind of wander about. As for Mobius, he's content with standing there a little bit longer and just letting time go by. Now, as for a couple other members of the TVA, you've got OB, who wrote his second edition ever of the TVA handbook. He's very excited about it. And then finally, there's somebody that we thought was gone, and that's Renslayer. Yes, she got pruned, but she wakes up in a field with a pyramid off in the distance. And then she sees something horrifying. It doesn't seem like it's Goliath because the light around her isn't green. No, the light around her is purple. And that is how Loki Season 2 ends. Thank you so much for getting this part of the recap. Please consider subscribing to the channel. Hit thumbs up if you like this. Smash that thumbs down button if you thought this video just absolutely sucked. Be nice in the comment section. If I got something wrong, hey, it happens. You make mistakes, right? Don't be a dick. Instead, go buy a t-shirt. I have those. I have plenty of merch. Go buy a mug or something. It'll make you happy. It'll make me happy. It's a win-win. Just know I do appreciate you guys checking this video out, though.